Hello and welcome to Unit 3. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about motherboards. So let's go ahead and go to the book. And here we see Chapter 3, all about motherboards. The motherboard is the most important component, arguably, in the entire computer. And this is because everything goes through it. Everything is connected to it. The CPU, the RAM, all the I/O devices, so on. So here in the chapter, it talks about the various motherboard types and features, and then a form factor. The form factor is a standard, it's a very standard, precise way that governs how a motherboard is sized, the way that the air flows throughout the closed case, the components, everything. ATX is the most popular form factor. Here's a micro ATX. And here we see ATX, micro ATX, and mini ATX motherboard dimensions. So as I say, this is very standard and like I say, governed as to how this is going to be. And these black dots that you see here, those are the screw holes. So on every ATX board, you'll see screw holes. Here, 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 here. And then for micro, it'd be here, 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 here. And then for mini, it's here, 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 and here. And then the chapter gets into processor sockets. There are many, many, many different types of processors now. And if your goal is certification, you're going to have a lot of memorizing to do. Here we see one type of processor with its socket. And here is the socket now that it's open. This is a plastic protective cover that's shipped with the motherboard to protect these pins. It's some type of a grid array, a ball grid or a pin grid array, probably a PGA. Oh, nope, this is LGA, it looks like. LAN grid array. This is another LGA type and LGA. So what we see here, this is the bottom side of the CPU. See all these gold dots? That's actually gold. Why do we use a lot of gold for contacts in computers? Because it doesn't oxidize and it's very stable. So, and then here's the inside of the socket. So this is where the two make connection. This would obviously be turned over. This is probably a Pentium 3 is my guess, because it looks like this is L3 cache down here on the inside, and L1 and L2 cache along with the registers are on the bottom side here. When you're putting in a processor, you need to be very careful. Try to touch the edges only. You don't want to get oil or dirt from your hands on any part in any portion of the computer itself, because oil from your hands will create hot spots on that component or components when the power is applied, and that could create a burnout. You have to match the processor to the socket on the motherboard. You can't just say, well, I need to upgrade my processor, or this one needs to change, so let's make it something else. No, it needs to match. And how do you find the match? You need to look it up in the manual for the motherboard itself, and it will say this motherboard supports this type of processor with this many contacts, like an LGA 775 or something to that effect, and it needs to be an Intel of this type and between this gigahertz range and this gigahertz range. You cannot go outside those boundaries. And then chipset. Chipset, as we see here, this looks like it's for a Pentium 3 because the memory bus is going through the north bridge. Here's the south bridge. Here's the processor. PCIe, PCIe, PCIe. Here's the drives, USB, sound. There's another PCI bus, and looks like another PCI. And then here's FireWire. So what this does is processor, north bridge, south bridge, everything is controlled through these two chips. All the I/O comes in and then is channeled through the front side bus, FSB, to the processor. This changed in the I series, I believe. The RAM got its own direct channel to the I series Pentiums. And it makes sense, because what happened? As things sped up and we went to 64-bit processing operating systems, the front side bus got slammed. It became a choke point. So that had to be relieved. How do you do that? You give RAM direct access with the CPU and vice versa. And then you widen this too. Talking more about processor types, this is a passive heatsink, usually made out of aluminum. That's probably the north bridge. There's a coin cell. There's the P1 power connector. RAM chips. Here are two hands-on projects, 3-1, 3-2. Identify the Intel chipset and processor on your computer. And then research the Intel ARC database. Yes, do this if you can do this carefully without damaging things. Email me if you have any questions or need help. And then we have buses and expansion slots. We talk about that. What does an expansion slot do? It allows you to expand the capabilities of the computer itself, usually through a card. And then, here we go, talk about PCI, conventional PCI. Here are the PCI slots. Dual channel, dual CPUs, right? A lot of RAM slots in this motherboard. And then we talk about mini PCI and mini PCI Express and laptop computers. Everything is scaled down in notebooks or laptops. And then here's a PCI riser card. Not so common to use. Very, very little use. Oops. Here's an I/O shield. This protects the. It's a barrier between the inside and the outside of the case, and it goes around all the components. The various sockets that are on the back side of the motherboard. This is also grounded to every single connector, which makes sense because you're making a connection. There's electricity passing over it or through it. Here's a hands-on project 3-3. examine a motherboard in detail. Write about this if you can. Be careful when you're doing this. Email me beforehand, before you get started, if you have questions or need help. Here's hands-on project 3-4, examine motherboard documentation. Yes, you can probably do this a lot easier than 3-3 if you don't have access to the resources. Here the chapter talks about configuring a motherboard and using the BIOS setup to configure a motherboard. Accessing a BIOS setup program. Press delete to change setup or press F2 for setup. BIOS, basic input-output system. And BIOS controls how the machine boots. We can change the boot sequence. We can configure onboard devices. We can view hard drive and optical drive information. We can control the processor and the clock speeds. We can monitor temperatures, fan speeds, and voltages. We can handle intrusion detection into the actual case itself. And then power on passwords. So you'd have to have a password to even power the machine up. And then here's BIOS support for virtualization, load jack for laptop technology, drive encryption and drive password protection. Here we go, talking about trusted platform module chip and hard drive encryption. Very important today, right? Here's a hands-on project 3-5. Examine BIOS settings. Don't do this unless you really know what you're doing or feel comfortable doing it, because you can really mess things up pretty badly. So if you have any questions before you want to do this, please email me and I will try to answer your questions. And then here the chapter talks about UEFI to set up to configure a motherboard. There's UEFI. How to maintain a motherboard, updating the drivers. Flashing the BIOS. This is actually flashing the CMOS. And this is done very rarely. And before you flash BIOS, number one, make sure you know what you're doing. 2, make sure it's absolutely necessary. And 3, make sure you have really good backups of everything. Flashing UEFI, same thing. And then here we go, talking about jump burst settings to clear BIOS settings. Replacing a CMOS battery about every 6 years, 6 to 8 years. It's called a coin cell. How to select a desktop motherboard. How to install or replace a motherboard. Again, wearing ESD gloves. The machine is fully unplugged and discharged. Hands-on project 3-7. Insert and remove motherboards. Email me beforehand if you'd like to do this or if you have any questions. And then here's a chapter summary. Reviewing the basics, key terms, and then thinking critically, and then real problems, real solutions. You could write about this if you'd like to. And that's the chapter.